There's a particular kind of person, someone who developed too fast, not physically, emotionally, mentally. They became aware of things other kids their age weren't aware of. They understood things, they saw through things, and by the time they reached their teenage years, they were fundamentally different from everyone around them. You might know someone like this. You might even be someone like this. And here's what's strange about it. They look their age, but they're living in a completely different world than their peers. Watch them in a room full of people their own age. There's a disconnect. The jokes that make everyone else laugh land flat. The things that excite their peers feel hollow to them. The drama that consumes their friend group feels trivial. They're physically present, but mentally somewhere else, somewhere older, and they can't quite figure out how to come back. The thing about being mature early is that it's isolating in a way that's hard to explain, because everyone around you is having fun, everyone's living in the moment, everyone's worried about social status and weekend plans and who likes who, and you're thinking about bigger things. You're aware of mortality, you're thinking about meaning, you're questioning the point of it all. While everyone's taking selfies, you're wondering if any of this matters. And here's what's messed up. You can't go back. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't unknow what you've learned. You can't pretend to be the age you are when you've already become older inside. So you exist in this strange liminal space, chronologically young, but psychologically advanced. And nobody understands. They think you're being weird. They think you're being pretentious. They think you're trying to be above everyone. But you're not. You're just stuck.
This is what happens when someone matures early. Their emotional and intellectual development outpaces their age. They develop an understanding of themselves and the world that's more sophisticated than their peers. And this creates a fundamental misalignment. They're living in one reality, everyone around them is living in another, and the gap keeps widening. Think about what it's like to be in school, surrounded by people your age, and realize you have almost nothing in common with them. They care about things you stopped caring about years ago. They're excited about social status. You're thinking about philosophy. They're obsessed with fitting in. You've already accepted that you don't fit in. They're navigating first crushes. You're thinking about what love actually means. The gap isn't just there, it's growing. Here's what's particularly painful. You want to connect with your peers. You want to have that lightness, that fun, that carefree nature that comes with being young. But you can't. It doesn't resonate. It feels fake. When you try to participate in the things your age group is doing, it feels like you're pretending to be someone younger than you actually are. So you withdraw. You start gravitating toward older people, toward people who get it, toward people who are actually on your wavelength.
The psychology of this is that your internal reference point has shifted. You're not measuring yourself against your peers anymore. You can't. They're too far behind. So you measure yourself against older people, more mature people, people who have actually lived some life. And that becomes your baseline. So when you're forced to be around people your own age, you feel ancient. What's interesting is that people who mature early often become hyper-rational. They develop strong intellectual frameworks. They care about understanding things deeply. And emotions, especially the volatile emotions of teenagers, start to feel immature to them. So they create distance. They become the observer. They judge their peers silently, not out of meanness, but out of a sense that they're on a different level. And that sense of superiority, while understandable, isolates them further. Because people can feel when you're judging them. They can feel when you think they're beneath you. So they pull back. They exclude you. They make jokes at your expense. And the person who matured early ends up alone.
not because they're weird, but because they've unconsciously positioned themselves as above their peer group. The people who matured early seem like they have everything figured out, like they're ahead of the curve, and sometimes that's true. But sometimes early maturity just leads to a person who feels disconnected from their own life, who feels like they're living in the wrong era, who feels like their peers are children and they're the only adult in the room. There's often a subtle contempt that develops, not conscious necessarily, but it's there. Contempt for the shallowness of their peer group, for the things they care about, for the way they navigate relationships, for the fact that they haven't figured out things that the early maturer already understands. And this contempt, while sometimes justified, is also a defense mechanism. It's protection from the loneliness of not fitting in.
Now, here's the crucial part. Early maturity doesn't happen randomly. It comes from exposure. Exposure to adult conversations, exposure to adult problems. Growing up in a house where you had to understand complex family dynamics. Growing up where you were treated as more mature than you actually were. Some people matured early because they had parents who talked to them like adults, who shared things with them that kids shouldn't hear, who made them emotionally responsible for managing adult relationships or problems. So they learned to think like adults early. They developed adult concerns before they were actually adults. Others were exposed to trauma or loss early. A death in the family, a serious illness, real instability. And that forces you to grow up. You can't stay in childhood when you've been confronted with real pain. So you fast forward, you skip the light-hearted middle years and jump straight to understanding that life is serious. Some grew up in environments where they had to be mature. Maybe they had a mentally ill parent. Maybe they had a sibling they had to look after. Maybe they had to be the parent in the family. So they became adults early, not by choice, but by necessity. And that's burned into them now.
Others were simply born observant, born thoughtful. They naturally thought deeper than their peers. They naturally questioned things. They naturally saw through bullshit. So they developed faster. Not because they had to, but because that's who they were, and the world couldn't give them what they needed at their age. The problem is that this early maturity becomes permanent, even as they get older, even as their peers eventually catch up developmentally. The damage is done. The disconnection is already established. They've learned to be alone. They've learned not to trust that their peers could understand them. So even when people around them mature, the early maturer often can't reconnect. The pattern is already set. And there's often a bitterness that comes with this, a resentment of having missed out on the joy of being young, of having to be serious when everyone else got to be silly, of having to understand things when everyone else got to be ignorant and carefree. They look at their peers and see people who had something they didn't have, a certain freedom, a certain lightness, a certain ability to just enjoy things without analyzing them to death. The early maturer often becomes the person who can't do things just for fun. Everything has to have a point. Everything has to be meaningful. Everything has to matter. And that's exhausting. Because most of human experience isn't about meaning or depth. Most of it is just about showing up and being present. But the early maturer can't. They've been trained to see meaning everywhere. They're also often the people who struggle with relationships, because most relationships don't operate at the level of depth and complexity they need. Most people just want to be loved and have fun. But the early maturer wants to understand everything. They want to analyze the dynamic. They want to know where it's going and why it matters. And that's a lot for another person to handle. So relationships end over and over. And they tell themselves it's because other people are too immature. The tragedy of early maturity is that it trades one kind of suffering for another. Instead of the normal suffering of growing up, you get the suffering of not growing up with your peers. Instead of the normal anxiety of adolescence, you get the alienation of being fundamentally different. Instead of normal teenage drama, you get the isolation of understanding more than you want to understand. But here's what's important. Being mature early isn't a curse, it's a characteristic. And like all characteristics, it has strengths and weaknesses. The strength is that you see things clearly, you understand complexity, you're capable of depth that your peers aren't. You're not susceptible to the same bullshit that consumes other people. That's genuinely valuable. The challenge is learning to bridge the gap, learning to be present with people even when they're not at your level of development, learning to enjoy things that don't require deep analysis, learning to laugh at jokes even if you see the punchline before it lands, learning that being mature doesn't mean you have to be serious all the time, learning that you can be intellectually advanced and still have fun. It's about finding your people eventually, because they're out there, the other early maturers, the other people who see things the way you do, the other people who think the way you think. And when you find them, something shifts. Suddenly you're not alone. Suddenly you don't feel ancient. Suddenly being mature early isn't a burden. It's just who you are.
It's also about learning to be gentle with yourself and with people who are still in the process of growing. Recognizing that your peers aren't immature by choice, they're just on a different timeline. And your way of seeing isn't the only valid way. It's just a different way. A more complex way, maybe, but not the only way. If this resonates, if you're recognizing that feeling of being fundamentally different from people your age, if you've always felt like you were born in the wrong era, know that it's real. You're not imagining the gap. You're not being pretentious. You're just developing faster than the people around you. And that comes with a particular kind of loneliness. But it doesn't have to be permanent. As you get older, as you find your people, as you learn to value both depth and lightness, things shift. The isolation can become solitude. The disconnection can become a superpower. The early maturity that made you different in school can become the thing that makes you interesting as an adult. Understanding these patterns, recognizing how early development shapes us, that's what we are doing here at The Forgotten Self. We're looking at the psychology of being ahead of your time, of growing too fast, of being the only one in the room who gets it. If this video helped you see something about yourself, subscribe, because we're building a community where people who matured early can finally feel understood, where being different isn't lonely, where being mature is celebrated. Until next time, try to enjoy something without analyzing it, just for today.